Good morning. I would encourage you to open up to Luke, the 10th chapter, Luke chapter 10. As you can tell, my voice has got about 30 minutes left in it, and I'm going to drain every last drop out of it this morning. So I cannot promise that the last 5 minutes will be audible, but I will be trying my best. As you can tell, my voice just cracked there on that one. I'm on day 3 of Zyrtec and allergies, so it's always a lot of fun. It's good to see, as we mentioned earlier, it's good to see so many people that are able to make it out with us. We have quite a bit of our number that's gone. We have quite a bit of our number that is with us, that is traveling, that is back. I know Jeff mentioned that Nathan and Robin were gone. It's good to have you guys back as well. I know that y'all were gone for a good reason, visiting a grandchild, but it's always good to have y'all with us too. It's hard to believe that it has been 20 years since 9/11. Don't laugh, I'm getting through this. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years since 9/11. And as much as we all remember that day, we all remember where we were, remember the exact moment, and I won't tell you where I was, all of us have stories like that, but we all remember what it was like in those moments when we first saw those towers start crumbling down. And we remember just the devastation, we remember the pain, remember the anguish, the terror that was involved with that. We remember the panic, excuse me. We remember the panic associated with that. But we also remember there's a lot of good things that are happening that day. I'll always remember, for whatever reason, the sight of George W. Bush standing there in the rubble that night after what seemed to be a very chaotic day, standing there with that bullhorn and talking about how strong America was and how proud he was of all the great people in that time period. And it almost seems like a juxtaposition in a lot of ways, because when I look at that picture of George Bush, I don't just see the president, I see the rubble behind that. I see the devastation, I see the pain. But when I also see the president, I also see the pain, I also see the heroes of that day. The first responders who were there in that moment, the people who rushed into the building when those buildings were starting to crumble down. And that almost creates a weird dichotomy in a lot of ways. It creates a juxtaposition between two extremes. On the one hand, you have terror, you have pain, you have anguish, much like you listening to my voice right now, but you also have just straight heroism. You have unbridled courage, you have unbridled passion and loyalty and dedication that almost just seems to border on the legendary, if you can use that phrase 20 years later. And that's an interesting juxtaposition, but it's not just unique to that time period. It oftentimes seems that in those time periods that it gets really bad, that's when you see things get really, really good, that you see that ray of sunshine poke through. For instance, the greatest period of tragedy in the history of the world, I would argue, is the time when Jesus died on the cross. You don't have a time period, at least to my understanding, that there's more devastation, more tragedy, more sorrow than in that one moment. So great to the point that it says darkness overcast the land. And as tragic as that whole situation is, the darkness almost seems to create a metaphor for what was going on in the world. Was it physically dark? Yes, I do think so. But it was also spiritually dark in that moment. But think about all the good that was happening. Not only was there the death and destruction, but there was also Jesus' instruction for John to take care of his mom. There was also Jesus giving comfort to the thief that was hanging next to him. There was also Jesus praying for forgiveness for those that were around him. And so in those dark moments, in that really tragic, horrific moment of Jesus dying on the cross, you have these rays of sunshine that shoot through, that speak to the mercy of God. And that almost seems to be a pattern in a lot of ways. That in these moments of horrificness, these tragedy, you see those rays of mercy shoot through. For instance, you can look at these scenes that unfolded on 9/11, where you have the firefighters that are going up into the towers, displaying an incredible amount of bravery. But the only reason they're doing that is because of the devastation of 9/11. You can look at Hurricane Harvey that happened a few years ago, and you can look at the scenes of human triumph and peace and mercy where they extended their arms to help a lady who had been trapped in her car during the middle of the flooding. The only reason that scene happens is because of the devastation of Hurricane Harvey. And so it's this weird dichotomy, if you will, where it almost seems in order for these scenes of great mercy to triumph, you have to have devastation. And it almost seems that the greater the devastation, temptation, the greater the scenes of mercy. And you see that all over the place. It's a weird juxtaposition, if you will. It's been said, and I think rightfully so, that grace is being given what we don't deserve, while mercy is not being given what we do deserve. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. That phrase preaches really well, but I don't think it encompasses every scene across the board. Look at Luke, the 10th chapter. This could very easily be the shortest sermon I ever preach. Look at Luke, the 10th chapter. Luke chapter 10 and verse 29, I love how this whole thing begins with a guy trying to justify himself, as if we wouldn't be doing the same thing. A lot of us wouldn't be doing the same thing in talking to Jesus. He says, but wishing to justify himself, he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus, verse 30, replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the robbers. They stripped him, they beat him, they went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down on that road. When he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, the Levite also. When he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him. When we saw him, he felt compassion. Came to him, bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, put him on his own beast, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will pay you. Which of these 3, verse 36, do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? Verse 37, notice the word choice. He said, the one who showed mercy towards him. Jesus says, verse 37, go and do likewise. I think it's very fitting that the phrase that's used to describe this person's actions is not grace. That would be a kind of a different concept. It's not hospitality. It's mercy. He says the one who was a neighbor to him was the one who showed mercy to him. And so right here, you see another evidence of what we're talking about. That in the midst of all of this tragedy and all this destruction, all this sadness, this Samaritan is beaten and left for dead. You have the amazing story of the Good Samaritan. And I think also when it points out there in that phrase in verse 37, go and do likewise, what that means is that we are to look for opportunities to show mercy as well. We are to look for time periods where we can see the mercy, where we can look for the mercy, and where we can do a lot of what he's talking about right there in that moment. Maybe we're not going out and walking down the hills of Jericho, but we're certainly looking for opportunities where we can intervene. Where somebody is not given, somebody is on a path, somebody is heading a direction, and somehow there's an intervention that doesn't need to take place, but does take place, and it saves that person's life. The key is we have to be looking for that. So how do we look for the mercy? How do we find the mercy? Well, first and foremost, I would argue too that we need to look for the inequality. The very essence of mercy is that it's unequal. Let me tell you something right now. The Samaritan had absolutely nothing to gain by doing what he did. As a matter of fact, you have 2 other people, a Levite and a priest, who are specifically chosen, I believe, by Jesus for their religious office, who did not show mercy to them. And you know that those 2 people probably preached hundreds of sermons about mercy. And they didn't show mercy to him. But that Samaritan, who everybody hated, all the Jews hated in that time period, had the opportunity to show mercy to him. But he did not have anything to gain by that moment. What would he have done if he says to the innkeeper, whatever he gives to you, whatever he charges to you, put that on my account? What would have happened if that guy had then taken that credit card and just run up room service and just run up a rental car, all these different things? That was the risk he was willing to take. There was a natural inequality there where somebody who was in one position debased themselves to take care of somebody else. That's where the inequality was, and that's where the mercy was to be found. Look at Matthew, the 18th chapter. Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 23. Listen to what he says here in this verse, or in this parable. We'll only read about half of it. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 23, it says, for this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he had begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. But since he didn't have the means to repay, his lord commanded him to be sold, along with his wife and children and all that he had, and a repayment to be made, which was his legal right to do. Verse 26, so the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. Verse 27, the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him that debt. There's no question in this scene who is in the position of authority. You have the master who holds this enormous debt, and people have judged it to be in the tens or possibly even the hundreds of millions of dollars. And you have this person who is in an enormous position of authority, and he forgives the debt from the person who begs him for no other reason than simply compassion. But mercy is in play here. As a matter of fact, the master will say this later. Look in verse 32 of this same chapter. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 32. It says, then summoning him after that slave goes out and doesn't extend mercy. It says, then summoning him, his Lord said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you? The position of authority is the same, even if it's a little bit decreased in magnitude. You have this person who owns this enormous debt of this other person, and he forgives it purely because of compassion. No other reason. Notice the inequality. And notice the compassion extends that just a little bit. But then that same slave, not realizing the gift he's been given, goes out and choke slams another guy for $100 and says, you're going to pay me back what you owe. And the master looks at him and says, do you not realize the magnitude, the mercy that I forgave you? That's the same mercy that you should have extended. That takes into account what God assumes about our relationships with each other. God assumes from this parable, and by the way, we'll get into context in just a second, but God assumes from this parable that we will recognize the mercy extended to us and extend that same mercy to other people. That's what's assumed in this parable. It's not a coincidence, by the way. Kind of piggybacking off that comment, it's not a coincidence that this story immediately happens after Peter asks about interpersonal relationships. Look in verse 15 in this same chapter. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15. He says, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he doesn't listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, verse 19, that if two of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where two or three have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. And notice how Peter completely misses the concept of that statement. Because in verse 21, Peter comes up and says to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me? In other words, how long do I need to go through this process about a specific sin and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus says, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven. And then the parable begins. The whole point of this parable is that you extend mercy to other people at a point that you will try to bring them back. That's the whole goal of this. That's why in Matthew the 18th chapter he talks about going to them not to confront them out of anger, but with the goal of bringing them back. Restoration is the goal. That's the whole point of that parable, is the understanding of inequality, the mercy that is extended to them for the betterment of that person. And it takes somebody in a position of authority or in a different position to say to themselves, I am going to help you. And that's why people who break Matthew 18 are in direct violation of that. It's because your goal is not to help the person. Your goal is to tattle. Your goal is to talk behind their back. You're not trying to build them up. The point of going to somebody is so that they can be restored. Look at what he says in Matthew 18 and verse 14. One verse right before this that predates all of this. Matthew 18 and verse 14. It is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. If that's not the will of God, then that shouldn't be the will of us who call ourselves Christians. Look for the inequality and you'll see the opportunities to dispel mercy. Look at Psalm 103. There's no better picture of what mercy looks like than our relationship with God. And in Psalm 103, starting in verse 8, Psalm 103 and verse 8. Psalm Psalm 103 and verse 8, it says, "The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. He will not always strive with us, nor will he keep his anger forever. He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities." That's a great verse that sums up mercy right there. "For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his loving kindness towards those who fear them. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us, just as a father has compassion on his children. So the Lord has compassion on those who fear him, for he himself knows our frame, and he is mindful that we are but dust." Is there a greater inequality than exists between humans and God? I would argue that there isn't. Is there a greater need for mercy than in our relationship with God? I would argue that there isn't. And the only reason God extends that mercy to us is the same reason that Lord extended mercy to his servant, because he felt compassion on him. It's a great Bible study to do if you're ever in the mood for it. There's a fantastic Bible study you can do where you look through the Gospels and you pinpoint all the times that simply says Jesus had compassion on somebody. That's it. Jesus has compassion on lepers. He has compassion on a mother who lost her child. He has compassion on the 5,000, the 4,000. He has compassion, and he does something. He sees the inequality and he fixes it. That's where mercy comes into play. But if you don't see it in the inequality, you can at least very easily see it in the opportunity. Let me tell you something right now, ladies and gentlemen. Mercy needs to be something that we look for. We don't see it oftentimes because we see it as a natural progression of the choices that people make. For instance, it would be very easy, and I'm not saying anybody in their right mind would necessarily say this, but it would be very easy for somebody to see the woman who was trapped in her car in Hurricane Harvey and say, "Well, that's what you get for driving downtown during a flood. How dare you do that? I'm just going to keep going." And even though in kind of an extreme example, that's what Jesus is personifying with the priest and Levite who passed by the Samaritan. How dare you? You know that there are robbers in this area. You know that these are dangerous places. This is not my concern. I'm going to go on about my way. That's not the opportunity that he's talking about. And I'm not excusing bad behavior. I'm not excusing bad choices in life. But what I am saying is that there are pristine opportunities for someone to show mercy in the life of somebody else if we look for them. Seeing this moments, I would argue, requires a certain mindset. It not only requires somebody who wants to be a helper, who wants to help, but also somebody who is creative and farsighted enough to see the end result of those actions. Look in Romans, the 9th chapter. Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9, starting in verse 22. This whole discussion in Romans 9 is leading to the eventual discussion about Jews and Gentiles, chapters 10 and 11. And it's all about grafting in one and not at the expense of the other. They need to learn to coexist. And a little bit of that argument centers around this perception that the Gentiles are just not as good, that they're over there. Or the perception from the Gentiles towards the Jews is, you murdered Jesus, you're not as good. In Romans chapter 9, he addresses both of these concepts. In verse 22, he says, and I love how Paul uses this what-if statement. What if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, what if he, instead of doing that, which he could have done, what if he endured with much patience vessels of wrath that were prepared for destruction? And he did so, verse 23, in order to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared even beforehand for glory. Even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As he says also in Hosea, I will call those who are not my people, and her who is not beloved, I'll call her beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word on the earth thoroughly and quickly, just as Isaiah foretold, unless the Lord of Sabaoth had left us a posterity, we would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. What should we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? because they didn't pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as is written, behold, I lay on Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. Jesus is the embodiment of faith. He's the embodiment of mercy. And what Paul is arguing for in this passage is, what if? He says, let's just take a crazy concept. And I love Paul's sarcasm. Let's just take a crazy concept. Let's say, for instance, that God, having his rights to annihilate the Gentiles for their immorality, what if he endured with them, seeing it as an opportunity to dispense his mercy and show his mercy to the entirety of the world? Why did he put up with Gentiles? Why did God put up with Jews for hundreds of years? I don't know why he did. I don't have the mind of God. That was kind of a rhetorical question. But what I do know is that shows the extent of his mercy. And Paul is arguing for there in Romans the 9th chapter, what if, just what if, Jews, that's the reason he did that. And if God did that, then how much more should we do that? You see it as an opportunity to do something else, to show the mercy of God, to show them what they can gain by being a child of God. When they see the mercy of us, they see the mercy of God. In Matthew the 9th chapter and verse 10, Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 10, it says, Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. Now when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, Why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and with the sinners? Ugh. If there could be like a sound effect there, you should put that sound effect right in there after verse 11. But when Jesus heard this, he said, It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. And I think with every power of his force, he says in verse 13, go and learn what this means. I desire compassion, your translation may say mercy, and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. That verse there in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13 comes from Hosea chapter 6 and verse 4, where God is literally asking the phrase, what am I going to do with this people? I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In other words, I want to be long-suffering with you, but I can't do it anymore. I've gone merciful, I've been merciful, but I can't do it anymore. But that's what I desire. And that's what we miss in the big scheme of the Old Testament, is we see destruction, we see judgment, we see persecution, we see exile, we see all these things. But what we always miss is the limits of God's mercy, which are nearly infinite. I guarantee you, the more you learn about the Old Testament, the more you will ask the question, why did God put up with this people? Conversely, the more we learn about ourselves, and the more we examine ourselves and the little things that we do that we know we probably shouldn't be doing, but we kind of hope to get away with, the more we examine ourselves against God, the more we ask ourselves, why is God wasting his time with me? But when we grab onto that mercy, we hold on to that hope, that's what fills us with spiritual energy. God saw the opportunity in each and every one of you. He saw the opportunity in me. Not to just let me pay for my sins, but the opportunity to make me into something that could be to his glory. What an opportunity that is. Finally, look for the sacrifice. Extending mercy to someone almost always comes with at least the risk of great personal sacrifice. Those firefighters, those first responders, those police officers that ran up into the Twin Towers on 9/11, they probably knew better than anybody else that they were not going to come down, and it didn't stop them. You saw person after person after person run up those Twin Towers, and they knew they probably weren't coming down, but they did it because they knew that they didn't, innocent people would die. There's almost always a great personal cost that finds itself on the end of mercy. We need to remember that. In the Old Testament, if you'll go with me a little bit into the weeds here, in the Old Testament there's the description of the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark, the temple, and the tabernacle, which I know the temple more or less replaced the tabernacle, but you have these grand descriptions of the spiritual worship of Egypt, or of Israel. And in regards to the clothes, in regards to the altars, in regards to the sacrifices, there's this description the closer you get towards God. And the closer you get towards God, there's the description not just of the gold, but of what's called the mercy seat. And the mercy seat, for those who aren't aware of the term, the mercy seat is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And it's described as being the mercy seat with two seraphim that are on top of it. And that is the place that once a year, the high priest, as he points out here in Exodus chapter 25, that is the one place where the high priest meets God. I want you to go to Exodus chapter 25. Look at this description here. This would be the point where I would ask somebody else to read, but I'm just going to power through. Exodus chapter 25, starting in verse 17. Exodus chapter 25, starting in verse 17. He says, you shall make a mercy seat. This is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Make them of hammered work at the ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end, 1 cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim of one piece with the mercy seat at its 2 ends. The cherubim shall have their wings spread upward, covering the mercy seat with their wings and facing one another. The faces of the cherubim are to be turned towards the mercy seat. That's the focal point. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony which I will give to you. There I will meet with you, verse 22. And from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim, which are upon the ark of the testimony, I will speak to you about all that I will give you in commandment for the sons of Israel. There's so much emphasis you can see in Exodus chapter 25 about the focal point being on the mercy seat. But the power of that comes in verse 22. When he says on the mercy seat, that's where I'm going to meet you. Right there, in that moment, at that place, that's where I'm going to meet you. The high priest walks into the tabernacle or the temple. He passes through the holy place where he sees the 7 different altar of incense. He sees the showbread. He sees this. He sees that. He passes through the veil. He goes into the Holy of Holies, and he sees the Ark of the Covenant, which has all these amazing things, 3 things inside of it. He sees the cherubim, but it's right there where the cherubim are focusing. That's where he meets with God. And if we want to meet God too, ladies and gentlemen, it comes at the point of mercy. There's a reason why when the guy walks in, when the high priest walks in, he doesn't just take blood and sprinkles it on the outside and then walks in and he's completely free. He takes some of the blood from the altar of the sacrifice and he puts it on the mercy seat, because it's at the point of sacrifice that mercy happens. It's at the point of mercy that's where we meet God. You want to know everything you need to know about God? You can talk about His love, you can talk about His grace, you can talk about His long-suffering, but you cannot evade a conversation about God without talking about His mercy. That's where we meet God. And isn't that why we take the word supper every single week? We won't take the time to read this in 1 Corinthians 11, primarily because I don't think my voice will handle it. But when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 down through verse 30, the emphasis in those verses is on God. This do in remembrance of me. This do in remembrance of me. Said twice. He says also there in this passage, take my body, which is broken, take my blood and drink it. The focus is on Jesus, because Jesus is the epitome of sacrifice. And if we want to find a spot for mercy, look for the spot where we can sacrifice, where we can give of ourselves to help other people for no other reason than just because we're merciful. You know, someone will say to me, God can't forgive me because I'm too great of a sinner. I'm just too great of a sinner. You don't know what my life is like. I used to be this. I used to be that. I've done this, which is horrendous. Let me tell you something right now. You are the very reason that Jesus died on the cross. As we talked about a second ago, the greatest rays of mercy come from the most tragic moments. And if we look and see the fact that God gave His Son to die on the cross for your sins, the most supreme being on the most debased cross of Himself, free will, then you'll have some idea of the sacrifice that He made for you. And so if you're sitting there saying to yourself, God can't forgive me, well, He did this. What more can you ask for God to do? And the magnitude of that sacrifice can pave the way for your salvation if you'll let it, if you'll meet Him at the mercy points, if you'll meet Him where He wants you to meet, which is that sacrifice, if you'll meet Him in obedience. That's what He asks for us to do. That's what He wants us to do, is to take that step towards Him, to announce our confession, to announce our obedience, to have our sins washed away, to meet Him at the point of mercy. And as we go through our lives, take these same principles of mercy and apply them to other people. As Russell prayed this morning, take the same things that we talked about this morning and apply them in our goodwill towards other people. Extend mercy where they don't deserve it. Extend mercy where it won't benefit you at all. But do it because you know it will make them better. That's what mercy is all about. And if we can help you with your spiritual journey, I would encourage you, please come as we stand and as we sing.